In preparation for this sermon, I started by going to YouTube and watching some film adaptations of this iconic, dramatic, incredible scene. And of course, I started with the classic 1956 Ten Commandments. Charlton Heston is just so confident. He rallies the people with such surety and then climbs to that little outlook that they build on the soundstage, raises his arms with one staff in a hand, and boom, the waters are suddenly torn apart, right down the middle. This is kind of how I imagined Moses when I was growing up. Clear, certain, just this classic confident leader who knew God was on their side. Which is funny because I didn't really watch that movie as a kid. No, instead, when I was younger, the definitive film adaptation of the Exodus story was, of course, the 1998 DreamWorks animated production, The Prince of Egypt. I don't know if y'all have seen it, but it's great. I rewatched the scene from that version, and I just teared up right away. I'm a very serious fan of hand-drawn animation, and I had forgotten how beautifully they had rendered the parting of the Red Sea. Just this astonishing blend of physical mediums, line drawings, and watercolors. But really what stood out to me in comparison was how unsure Moses seemed in that moment. If in 1956, Moses ran up to the edge and reached out in an explosion of faith, in 1998, he moved a little more slowly, a little more carefully, perhaps carrying a few more questions. Now, that moment, that very first reaching out, it passes so quickly in the text that we just read. In fact, most of the passage that we heard involves describing the destruction of Pharaoh's army, which makes sense given that the most accessible traditional interpretation of this scene is about God conquering a worldly power in Pharaoh. So, in a way, Charlton Heston is staying true to how the authors of Exodus depicted it. But if I'm being honest, I tend to imagine that moment not very quick. I imagine it feeling like an eternity. Now, part of what makes this scene so incredible to me is how deliberate it is. God has directed the Israelites into this exact position. They could have just kept running. They could have gone a more direct route. So what is God doing here? I mean, every detail is so intentional because I really think God is setting this stage just so for this particular deeper meeting. And it moves by so quickly, like I said, so we'll slow it down for a second. We hear about the pillar of cloud and flame, and this is what has been leading them. But in this moment, it moves around and gets behind them. The text, as we read it, it says that it separates the armies. But other translations that we've looked at, or that I was looking at for this, that sentence gets translated really differently. Sometimes it's just that it's separated the armies and they never see each other. Sometimes it talks about separating light from darkness. There's even a translation that says on the Israelite side, it's shining light, but on Pharaoh's side, it's shining darkness. Very interesting, a lot of possibilities there. But I started looking at that, and separating light from darkness reminded me of something else. Genesis 1, the first day. God separates the light from the dark. Now, making a creation moment out of this, I don't think it's the same as starting over, right? I mean, this is not the great flood and wiping over and beginning humanity anew. So why else would this try to evoke this creative moment of having separated light and dark just before we're about to part waters and separate the waters, which is day 2? It's very loud to me, and I think that it's an emphasis on God's creative power. That what happens next is not just a flex of God's strength, but it is a moment of creation. Things seem impossible, and suddenly things are possible. Now, missing from today's passage, because it's earlier, we're going to back up a little bit, but there's a scene just before where God does tell Moses exactly what the plan is. He tells him exactly what to do. So Moses is walking into this with the sense of what is supposed to happen. But still, like I said, I have to wonder, did he doubt? Did he have questions? Here are some of the things that I would wonder. Why me? Why is this necessary? If it's God who's parting the waters, why ask me to reach out like this? We don't often hear people using the language of miracles to describe this event, but it is true. I did notice that the plagues detailed earlier in Exodus are all referred to as signs. Hadn't caught that before, but that's of course the same word that they're often used to describe miraculous events in Jesus' story. And what is it that signs do? They point to an aspect of God. They direct us to and reveal part of who God is. And in those moments, I always find myself looking for the invitation. I started this with the Gospels because it didn't necessarily speak to me, the idea that Jesus is just going around and doing these kind of tricks. Like they're acts of participation, right? And it's as true in the Gospels as it is here. God does not perform miracles at us, but God performs miracles with us. And even if the heavy lifting is disproportionately on God's end, we are always asked to do something. Sometimes that something can seem trivial, right? In this case, what does Moses reaching out with his hand matter to God's ability to blow a sea into a path? One read on this dynamic would be to focus on the obedience aspect of it. And sure, I do see some of that. But it doesn't really track for me that right before she's about to do something incredible, God gives us a little pop quiz, a test to see if we were listening. And there's a real tendency in the history of the church to conflate that kind of obedience with this sort of hierarchical, patriarchal worldview that kind of reduces faith to this act of submission. But I think that even though these asks are small, they're not just submission, they're active, they're involved. What I want to suggest to you is that the parting of the Red Sea is, in essence, a collaborative and creative act. It's kind of a group project. And by setting the scene to recall the first day, God is inviting Moses to participate in this creation reenactment and separating the waters here on the second day. Now, this collaborative nature of God's power is foreshadowed throughout Exodus, specifically with the language of hands. And if we back up a little bit and pay close attention, we'll see that God seems to build anticipation of this moment from the beginning. We won't go too far into it, but a few ones really jumped out at me. In chapter 3, when God first enlists Moses at the burning bush, he says, "I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders." And then, interestingly, performs 2 signs with Moses involving his hand. Grabs the staff that had just been turned into a stake, and he makes his hand appear leprous briefly, right? And then later in chapter 6, when Pharaoh's really starting to crack down on the Israelites and it's getting worse, Moses turns despairingly to the Lord and sort of accuses him of having done nothing at all to deliver your people. God responds with assurance, though, telling Moses, "You shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by a mighty hand he will let them go." And God tells Moses to tell the Israelites that they will be delivered, freed from slavery, and God will redeem you with an outstretched arm. And then later, almost all of the plagues do involve this instruction for Moses to stretch out his hand. So we're back to Moses reaching out over the waters. And it's a little cheeky, but I find myself wanting to ask, whose hand is the mighty hand here? I'm definitely not suggesting that Moses is some kind of demigod. I think there's a name for that heresy, so don't worry. But I actually think, in fact, as tends to be God's way, part of the point is that Moses is a regular person. We should also note that this staff, which is in the film adaptations, it's in the story, and it's actually in the instructions that God gives to Moses. In this moment, they don't even talk about it. You spend all this time building it up to be this symbol of power and this symbol of the ability to do miraculous things, and then in the moment, it's not there. It almost makes me think of this classic final act reveal in literature and stories, what some folks call the magic feather trope. But it's like where the hero gets to the final climactic scene and discovers that the magic was in them all along. You know, the Harry Potter scene. Ron Weasley plays a really good game, and he thinks that because he had taken this potion, but they forgot to give him the potion, and he's discovered an inner strength. I sort of feel part of that looking at this text. I want to say, Moses, your hand is mighty. Look at this. But it's not really that simple, is it? I mean, according to the text, it's not obvious what reaching out is really accomplishing in and of itself. What is clear is that Moses acts, and then God acts, and a new path is revealed. Now, we talk about Exodus as a text about liberation. It is one of the most profound proofs that God's love for us, God's vision for us, includes liberating the captive and freeing the oppressed. Enslavement of any kind is anathema to God's will, because God wants us to be free. God created us to be free. We're so familiar with this story, but really there is so much that is particular about the way God chooses to free the Israelites. We've already talked about this circuitous route, but consider this as well. If it was simply a power struggle between God and Pharaoh, why didn't God just flip the power structure of Egypt upside down? Why didn't God depose Pharaoh and install a chosen leader, someone who would rule the right way, the just way? All too often in our long human history, power struggles turn into cycles of oppression because we leave the structures of oppression in place while swapping out who's on top. It's like our power dynamics, our social structures, they take the shape of an hourglass, and then when time's up for a ruler or a ruling class, we just turn it over and wait for the sand to fall in the other direction. We accept how things are done and labor under the assurance that once our guy is sitting at the top, then all things will be made right. But truly breaking the chains means not leaving them in place for someone else's wrists. True liberation is a new vision altogether. True liberation is fundamentally a creative act of imagination. I'll say it again. True liberation is a creative act of imagination. There's a theologian I want to bring into this very briefly. She gets pretty heady, so we won't go too crazy on it, but this woman, Monica Coleman, she talks about God as the source of possibility in any given moment, calling to us in any context. God's call is never coercive, but always invitational. Sometimes loud, but often quiet. God does not force us to be a certain way, but no matter where we find ourselves, God is always inviting us towards a new, unforeseen possibility. We don't have to take it. Lord knows I have not always done so. But God presents options and paths that our human context just doesn't. This is because God, the Creator, speaks from a place of possibility and imagination that simply exceeds ours. But at the same time, God wants to work with us to guide us towards a freedom that transcends what we tell ourselves is possible. God's imagination is greater than ours, but part of God loving us is wanting to share those possibilities. Coleman calls this collaboration with God making a way out of no way. In our very real human limitations, it's not just that we don't see the secret third path. It's that in a certain way, that path doesn't exist without God's involvement. It's not as if Moses didn't notice a huge land bridge before. It did not yet exist. And that's because, as Coleman says, the way is made out of God. You can take a beat. That's heady. The way is made out of God. Now, I know we're talking about Exodus here, but I can't help but let my mind wander to Jesus Christ, who told us that he is the way. And isn't Jesus made of God? Doesn't Jesus' very existence create for us, in and through him, a new way where once there was none? I think of Moses standing there at the shore of the Red Sea, having been asked by God to basically back the Israelites into a corner, and just reaching forward with his hand towards the dark waters. The sea churns, impassable, impossible, and Moses reaches out. The stretching of his hand, that reach, I think is the crux of how we let God in, how we say yes to that invitation. It's hope. And there's no liberation without hope. And that's not even because hope is a prerequisite to being free. It's that to be free is to hope. I wonder, what is the Red Sea in your life? What is that limitation, that barrier so established and taken for granted that it shapes your paths like an immovable feature of geography? Perhaps there's something in your skill set you just assume you could never pull off. Maybe there's a relationship whose structure or dynamic feels set in stone. Maybe you feel called to different work, but the change feels impossible. I also wonder, because I'm always interested in the us story, where is our collective imagination falling short? Where have we grown to accept conditions that we know are unjust simply because that's the way things are and we can't think of another way? Wherever your heart goes in this moment, whatever comes to mind, I ask you to stand at that shore and listen for God's voice. Listen for new possibilities. Look for new and emerging paths. Dare to stretch out your hand to reach across the water, reach for the opposite shore. You may not know this about me yet, but I do have a stubbornly pragmatic streak. So if the reaching feels vulnerable or risky, believe me, I understand. But that's the point, isn't it? Because it is in the reaching, that wilderness of hope, that God speaks most clearly and from which new paths emerge.